For the Valley of the Moon Music Festival, I'm Carlo Caballero, Associate Professor of Music at the University of Colorado. I'm speaking to you from Boulder, but I look forward to a time when we can be together in Sonoma. In this pre-recorded talk, I intend to introduce you to one of Gabriel Fauré's large-scale chamber works, the Second Piano Quartet in G minor, Opus 45. What is the place of this piece in Fauré's creative life? It might be said to mark the turning point from his early style to his middle period, if we still believe in such historical conventions. In any event, he wrote it when he was 40 years old, so it inaugurates the music of his middle age, if not a middle period. His famous Requiem Mass, Opus 48, was composed shortly afterwards. Fauré always loved chamber music, and composed large and small-scale works for various combinations of instruments throughout his career, starting with his first violin sonata, Opus 13, in 1876, and ending with his string quartet, Opus 121, completed, but just barely, before his death in 1924. Born in 1845 in Pamiers, across the Pyrenees Mountains from Andorra in Spain, Fauré made his career in Paris and lived until 1924, a long life of nearly 80 years. To answer the question of where the second quartet stands in the work of a composer who lived so long, it is helpful to remind ourselves of the broad context in which Gabriel Fauré composed. Fauré is a famous composer in the repertoire of European music, to be sure, but he's not quite in the bracket of iconic figures who bask in charismatic mythologies like Mozart or Puccini or Stravinsky. Fauré lived a modest life, beginning his training as a church musician at the tender age of 9, slowly achieving a local reputation for his music in Paris and the regions, and then suddenly ascending at the age of 60 to a highly visible public office. In that year, 1905, he was chosen as the new director of the Paris Conservatory. Having served there for only 9 years as a composition teacher, and a somewhat controversial one. His highly individualistic students included Maurice Ravel, Nadia Boulanger, and Georges Enescu. This government position allowed Fauré to leave behind all his obligations as a church musician and organist, labors he termed mercenary in his most bitter moments. Like Mahler and Janacek, he composed mostly during the summer. When he was forced to retire because of deafness in September 1920, he accelerated his compositional agenda with a level of productivity that surpassed his youthful years and whose freshness even impressed the newest generation of composers, like Georges Auric, Arthur Honegger, and Darius Milhaud. Upon his death 4 years later, Gabriel Fauré, this charming, unassuming boy from a remote town in southern France, the last and unwanted 6th child of a family whose father was a provincial schoolmaster, ended up receiving the rare honor of a national funeral, a state ceremony that had been accorded to the likes of Victor Hugo, Louis Pasteur, and Émile Zola. We know almost nothing about the genesis of the Second Piano Quartet. The manuscript is undated, and there are no references to its composition in Fauré's surviving letters. Since the public premiere of the piece took place in January 1887, we deduce that Fauré composed it in 1885 or 1886. He had revised the finale of his first quartet for an April 1884 performance, and perhaps this work spurred the creation of a second piano quartet. In short, we know the date of the premiere, and we know that he dedicated the score to the conductor and pianist Hans von Bülow. Other than that, we know nothing about the process leading to the finished work. The dedication to von Bülow is unusual for Fauré, who usually dedicated his pieces to friends, to French performers, and to patrons. The German musician had praised Fauré's music in a brief shout-out to the Parisian press in 1884, and this may explain Fauré's decision to honor him with a dedication a year later. Perhaps Fauré hoped, too, that Hans von Bülow might take up the work, whose piano part is worthy of a virtuoso. But other than a pair of polite letters between the two men, offering and accepting the dedication, we know nothing of their relationship, or whether they ever even met. We might further wonder, did Fauré, who admired the music of Schubert and Schumann, mean his dedication to signal a more general homage to the Austro-German tradition of chamber music? This raises the larger question of the status of chamber music in Paris in the 1880s. It was, in effect, a medium moving from quiescence to prominence. Although chamber music had always been part of French musical culture, the centralization of French arts and politics in Paris lent the most prestige and monetary support to big public media, that is, opera and ballet. Nearly all French composers, including Fauré, aspired to success in the theater. During the Second Empire, when Fauré was a young man, the court of Napoleon III lavished enormous expense on the Paris opera and ballet. That was the heyday of Gounod, Offenbach, and Verdi. When Napoleon's government fell to the Prussian army at Sedan in 1870, there was bound to be a cultural reaction. The Second Empire, the fallen regime, became associated with decadence. The leaders of the new government, the Third Republic, sized up the conditions of French institutions, from schools to the military, and turned to examples of Prussian or German success, with an eye to emulating the people that had bested them. Of course, pride placed limits on such admiration, inflecting it toward self-interest. But it is important to remember that in the 1870s and 1880s, many progressive French politicians and artists looked to Germany on a path toward recovering French preeminence. In 1871, a group of young musicians, including Fauré and his former teacher Camille Saint-Saëns, gathered to form a new music society, the Société Nationale de Musique. They sought to promote new French instrumental music and song. This emphasis on homegrown music, however, did not mean that they neglected what Germany had to offer. On the contrary, they studied it, like their peers in the ministries of education and the National Army. And their emphasis on instrumental music did not mean that they did not want to succeed in the theater too. But the new society provided a fresh opportunity to cultivate chamber music in an atmosphere where something new and original might emerge, apart from the glorious but overweening tradition of French theater music, opera and ballet. As Fauré himself put it to a journalist late in life in 1922, "The truth is, before 1870 I would have never dreamt of composing a sonata or a quartet. At that period there was no chance of a composer getting a hearing with works like that. I was given the incentive when Saint-Saëns founded the Société Nationale de Musique in 1871." End quotation. Indeed, both of Fauré's piano quartets had their premieres at the Society, as did most of his other chamber music. Fauré's style is idiosyncratic and seldom reminds us of any other composer, French or otherwise. So then, since Fauré was cosmopolitan in outlook, unlike Debussy, a narrower nationalist, we would ask, which German composers informed his approach to classical forms, like sonatas, trios, quartets, and quintets? French composers of Fauré's generation admired a short syllabus of German masters: Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert, Weber, Robert Schumann, and Wagner. We need to add Franz Liszt, whatever his national identity. If I don't mention Mozart, by the way, it is because he had already been assimilated to the French tradition by the 1830s and was not really even looked upon as a Germanic composer. Like Chopin, Mozart was already French, and his operas were part of the French repertory. But if you wondered why Brahms was not on my list, well, that's another story. Outside of a few songs and piano duets, Brahms was not widely appreciated in France until the 1930s. Yet one sometimes finds Fauré and Brahms arriving at similar solutions. These are coincidences, however, and must be chalked up to their common admiration of a third man, Robert Schumann. Fauré had several opportunities to hear Brahms's music in Paris, but he never saw more in it than a kind of passionless academicism. In 1904, he concluded his exasperated review of Brahms's cold and insignificant Fourth Symphony, his adjectives, with the remark, quote, "Clearly, so many efforts to make us appreciate and love this music remain pointless." This doesn't mean that we can't hear something Brahmsian in the finale of Fauré's second quartet. Just remember to triangulate. It's not really Brahms, it's Schumann. Those who are familiar with Fauré's first piano quartet will find the second quartet darker, more difficult to penetrate, and in all but the third movement, rather more violent. The high level of invention in the two quartets is equal, but the harmonies and rhythms of the second one are more complex. Fauré also links the movements of the second quartet to one another by transforming themes in an almost secretive way, quite in contrast to the obvious manner in which Berlioz, Franck, or Liszt used this same technique. The transformations of earlier themes always occur in some interior moment of the later movements, not as a climax. The slow movement, so far as I can tell, does not participate in this thematic handshaking, only the scherzo and the finale, which contain transformations of three themes from the first movement. If this were a day for shop talk, I could march these comparisons out for you at the piano, try to get you to grasp them, but this is not the way Fauré intended listeners to enjoy his music. He was anti-didactic and anti-academic, despite being the director of a conservatory. And in my view, such a procedure is not helpful to appreciation. I loved this piece for years before I began to notice these thematic links. Such sneaky structural devices are the joy of advanced composition seminars. But for Fauré, they were really no more than a quiet means of unity, which the listener might feel but not really apprehend. Think of the composer here as a chef who manages to exploit cinnamon in 3 of the 4 courses served at table, but intends no one to observe this subtle aromatic artifice. Fauré seemed to view cyclical repetition across movements as a risky business. He did not use the technique in any other chamber work except the Second Violin Sonata of 1917. As a composer, he always wanted to avoid any hint of emphasis or ostentatious ingenuity. Now let me try to characterize the movements of the second piano quartet for you. First of all, the division of the work into 4 movements shows Fauré's respect for the classical heritage of the medium. But here, in contrast to Beethoven, the scherzo comes second rather than third, which was Fauré's preference when he included a scherzo in his chamber and orchestral music. This ordering puts 2 darkly energetic movements up against one another. It also lets the slow contemplative adagio, the only movement in major mode, come like a kind of balm to the listener. The finale returns to G minor in the darker energies of the opening, but gradually makes its way towards G major for a scintillating, bright ending to the quartet as a whole. In the first movement, we hear a powerful theme over an almost volcanic rumbling in the piano. The theme is heard in the strings, starting with a rising octave that falls a whole step, and then a dactylic motive, bum, ba, ba, bum, ba, ba, bum, that winds around in 4 chromatic tones until discharging on a cadence. Later, the second theme in E-flat major offers respite, but these patches of more lyrical melody never stem the electric energy of this opening material. In the last minute, a final eruption of the opening theme moves the harmony through more than half of the 24 possible chromatic triads, and the movement winds down on a kind of question mark. The scherzo that follows, whose slide is before us, is even more disturbing. The pianist's left hand sets up another ostinato machine, while the plucked strings seem menacing rather than playful. The main theme, mostly heard in the piano's right hand, is a constantly syncopated scalar pattern. Syncopated meaning that its long notes always fall on off beats, giving the theme an extremely unstable character as it zooms up and down the keyboard. There is no trio section to interrupt the course of the scherzo's nearly perpetual motion. Fauré gives us no respite. The British critic Bryce Morrison aptly described the zigzag momentum of this movement as a mad rush into darkness briefly illuminated by passing lights. The slow movement puts the listener at ease, dreamy and gentle from the start to the end, and remarkably free in form. Given that we know so little about the quartet as a whole, it is ironic that we know more about this movement than about almost any other instrumental piece by him. 20 years after its composition, Fauré made a passing comment about this adagio in a private letter. He explained to his wife that his music generally had no connections with external ideas or images, with one exception. That's the quotation before us from the letter. It is only in the adagio of the second quartet that I can remember having translated, and almost involuntarily, the very distant memory of bells ringing which evenings at Montgauzy would reach us from a village called Cadirac, when the wind blew from the west. Over this drone a vague reverie goes aloft, which, like all vague reveries, would be untranslatable by literary means. Yet isn't it often the case that something outside of us lulls us into thoughts of a sort so imprecise that in truth they are not thoughts, and yet there is something in which we take pleasure? The desire for non-existent things, perhaps. And that is indeed the domain of music. End quotation. Fauré's evocation of a distant memory of ringing bells in the adagio is a rare example of pictorialism in his music, and it happens to underwrite an overall surmise about his art that somehow, some way, in its most introspective passages, there is a correspondence to those moments of recaptured memory that haunt the literary work of his great admirer, Marcel Proust. In this movement, the slow movement, note how the sound of bells, evoked at first low on the piano, alternates with a melody in the viola that is something like a human response. Moreover, the bell theme eventually travels from the piano to the strings, with the viola and cello plucked very quietly beneath the violin, which is not a very bell-like sound at all. Indeed, that seems to be the point. The bells become more and more immaterial, less realistic as the movement goes on. And in the coda, with all the strings muted, we hear the culmination of this process. The tolling figure introduced by the cello is played 3 times as slow as originally, while the violin takes up the melody first heard in the viola. external stimulus has been absorbed in human introspection. It is a memory on the verge of the unreal. The finale resolves some of the contrasts in the earlier movements by combining the earnestness of the first two with a joyful proliferation of themes and a dance-like meter, 3/4. The sense of melodic prodigality in the movement, however, is something of an illusion, as Fauré has derived two of the three secondary ideas in the finale from the first movement. This finale is where, as I hinted, Fauré arrives at a hearty style that may remind us of a finale by Brahms, but it must be triangulated with Schumann's chamber music, as well as that of Fauré's former teacher, Saint-Saëns. I would like to end by thanking the artists we will hear in the quartet tonight. Eric Zivian, piano, Lisa Lee, violin, Liana Berube, viola, and Tanya Tompkins, cello. Emily Marvash, contralto, opens the recital with a beautiful selection of French songs. I hope to meet some of you in the post-concert Zoom meeting that the festival has arranged for us. I'll be happy to take questions.